everybody. Welcome back to Goodnight, Lighthouse. I'm Miss Dorothy, and I'm here to read you another story. And I've got a fun, important book tonight. It's a funny book with a very important lesson. Do you know what a tattletale is? A tattletale is somebody who just keeps telling on other people, even when there's not really anything to tell on. Like you just always go up and say, he did this, or she did that, or they did this. And sometimes it can drive your teachers and your mom and dad crazy. Well, this is a book about some tattletale little piggies. Yep, piggies. Because this book is called Don't Squeal Unless It's a Big Deal. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. This is a tale of a whole classroom of tattletales. It's a story about some little pigs that don't get along very well. And they keep telling their teacher that everybody's doing something wrong. And the teacher's just going crazy because they keep squealing on each other. And the teacher says, don't squeal until it's a big deal. We need to get into this book and find out what all this squealing is about and what the teacher does to fix it. You ready to get into this fun little pig book with Miss Dorothy? Good. I need you to sit up and listen up because here we go. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. A Tale of Tattletales, written by Jeanie Franz Ransom, illustrated by Jackie Urbanovich. There were 19 students in Mrs. McNeal's class and 19 tattletales. Oh no, look at all the little piggies. They don't look like they're getting along very well. It all started when Jessica trotted up to Mrs. McNeal's desk. Peter pulled my pigtail. That must have hurt, Mrs. McNeal said. Did you tell Peter that? Jessica nodded. Mrs. McNeal said, let's see what Peter has to say. Peter dragged his hoofs all the way up to Mrs. McNeal's desk. Jessica says you pulled her pigtail, Mrs. McNeal says. I did not, Peter said. Yes, you did, Jessica said. Oh no, now they're arguing about it. You both have the right to say how you feel, Mrs. McNeal said. You also have the right to feel safe and comfortable at school. Rules like keep your hooves to yourself make it easier to do that. Mrs. McNeal added, but since Jessica's tail is still attached, and Peter doesn't look particularly dangerous at the moment, I think it's safe to go back to your desks now. Jessica stomped. Peter snorted. Mrs. McNeal started humming The Farmer in the Dell. Mrs. McNeal had just lifted her cup of slop for a quick slurp when Stephen trotted up. Rachel took my pink marker and she won't give it back. I have even asked her 2 times. Mrs. McNeal put down her cup. Stephen, I'm so glad you tried to fix the problem yourself first by talking to Rachel, she said. Maybe her ears aren't working too well today. Let's find out. Stephen can't find his pink marker, Mrs. McNeal said. Have you seen it? I gave it back, Rachel cried. I can't find my pink marker. That's because you used it all up, Peter said. You're always drawing pictures of pigs. Rachel sniffled. For your information, those are pictures of moi. What am I supposed to do? Color myself green? Oh no, Rachel's all upset. You know our class rules, Rachel, said Mrs. McNeal. If you want to borrow something, ask first. It's how friends treat friends and stay friends. Mrs. McNeal is right. She should have asked if she wanted to borrow the marker. Mrs. McNeal had just taken her first sip of slop when Megan announced, Frankie called me Sucky a fat sow. Mrs. McNeal had to gulp her slop before she could speak. She cleared her throat and hoped she didn't have a corn kernel in her teeth. I'm glad you know our class rules so well, Mrs. McNeal said. You're right. We don't call each other names. Also, we don't try to fix problems that don't belong to us, Mrs. McNeal said. I know you're trying to help, but if Frankie and Suki have a problem, it's their job to fix it. If they can't, It's my job as the teacher to help them. Your job, Mrs. McNeal added, is to take care of you. That's the most important job you have. Megan danced the jig all the way back to her desk. But then the stampede started. Robbie breathed on me. Jonathan ripped my paper. Emily called my desk a pigsty. Jeremy's grunting and I can't concentrate. Laura looked at me. Sam's picking his snout. Oh no, they're all tattling on each other. Mrs. McNeal doesn't know what to do. The students had practically worn a path to Mrs. McNeal's dress and worn out her patience. When she stood up, the students sat down. Before we go to lunch, I think we need to add a new rule to our list, Mrs. McNeal said. A very important rule, she added. Can anyone tell me what squealing is? Students started squealing like their tails were stuck in a gate. Not that kind of squealing, Mrs. McNeal shouted, waving a cowbell. When the class was quiet, Mrs. McNeal continued. Squealing, she said, is my special word for tattling, and I know you know what that is. Look, she wrote on the board. New class rule. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. Some students looked at the floor. Some looked at each other. Some looked at the ceiling like they'd suddenly seen something interesting up there. Mrs. McNeal kept writing on the board. Here's our new class rule, Mrs. McNeal said. What does it mean? Jessica asked. I'm glad you asked, Mrs. McNeal said. To squeal on someone means you go tell a grown-up when someone does or says something you don't like, instead of telling that person first. Most problems that happen between kids are kid-sized problems. They can work out themselves, Mrs. McNeal said, usually by talking, listening, and helping each other. But sometimes, Mrs. McNeal said, something happens that's bigger than a kid-sized problem. When someone is hurt or in danger, or when a person is hurting you, or hurting a pet, or hurting something that doesn't belong to them, or that belongs to all of us. That's when it's okay to squeal, because that's a big deal. When it's a big deal, it's an emergency. That's when you need to hoof it and get help from a grown-up. Oscar raised his hoof. I know it's not a big deal, Mrs. McNeal, but I'm hungry enough to eat a haystack. Mrs. McNeal laughed. Me too. I'm sure we'll get to practice what we've learned when we get back. But that afternoon, Mrs. McNeal had barely closed the classroom gate when Katie said, Jenny hogged the rope swing at recess. Mrs. Meal pointed to the board. Remember what we just learned? Katie nodded. Then you know you need to tell Jenny first about the problem. Tell me what? Jenny yelled from across the room. That you were hogging the swing, Katie yelled back. You never asked for a turn, Jenny said. I didn't get a turn, Jeremy said. It's not my fault, Peter said. Not this time. It's Caroline's fault, Sookie said. Who's Caroline? Oscar asked. She's not even in our class, Frankie said. Oh no, they're doing it again. They're all squealing about things that are not a big deal. Thump! Ah! Mrs. McNeal had disappeared. Are you okay? Megan asked. Mrs. McNeal didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her tail was limp. One ear had something red on it. Quick! Call the office. Tell them it's an emergency. Somebody get the nurse. Somebody tell Mrs. Hamlin next door. Up. Now they are supposed to get help and tell, and they're doing it. Later that afternoon, the students visited Miss McNeal in the nurse's office. We're sorry we squealed so much today, Jessica said. We didn't mean to make you mad, Peter said. It's our fault, Katie cried. It wasn't anyone's fault, Mrs. McNeal said. It was an accident. I slipped on some spilled slop. It must have been quite a mess. We thought you had exploded, Jeremy said. It was pretty gross, Oscar added. Maybe you'd better not eat that stuff anymore, Rachel said. You need to take care of yourself. It sounds like all of you took care of the problem, Mrs. McNeal said. Everyone says you knew just what to do when I get hurt. Only because you're such a good teacher, Jessica said. And you're such good learners, Mrs. McNeal said. We still need some practice, Katie said. We all do when we learn something new, Mrs. McNeal said. So let's practice. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. Well, that was a good book. Oh my, did that book have a big lesson. Those little piglets were just squealing all the time. They were complaining about each other and telling on each other and griping all the time. It made their teacher crazy. And then their teacher slipped because they had made such a mess in the classroom and fell down. And then they were all worried about the teacher and they realized, you know what? We should not squeal unless it's a big deal. They learned an important lesson, and I hope you did too. And we learned it while reading a very fun book. You know, sometimes you have to tell your teacher and you have to tell your mom and dad what's going on. Like if someone is hurt or if someone is sad or if someone tries to hurt you, you have to tell your mom and dad. But you don't have to tell them every time somebody does something that's not important. You need to learn the difference because you always want to talk to your mom and dad and you always want to talk to your teacher about problems. But not everything is a big problem. So remember, don't squeal unless it's a big deal. This was a good book. I'm glad we read it together. It's an important lesson for us to learn. But right now, it's time for all my little piglets to get off to bed. I want you to get under your covers, get cuddled up, curled up, ready for a really good night's sleep. Give your mom and dad lots of hugs and kisses. And if there's anything that you're worried about or concerned about, or if somebody did something that you're not sure if it's right or wrong, talk to your mom and dad about it. That's not being a tattletale. That's just sharing with mom and dad. And I want you to always remember that you can trust your mom and dad with anything. You can talk to them about anything. So you be sure to do that if there's something bothering you. And you be sure to show mom and dad how big you are and how much you love them. Tomorrow, obey and obey right away. And then come back and see Miss Dorothy. I'm going to be sitting right here, ready to read another book to you. Bye! Thanks for reading with Miss Dorothy. I hope you enjoyed this book, and I hope you'll come back soon to read another. What's your favorite book? Drop Miss Dorothy a note and let me know. I'll go find it and I'll read it to you. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share. I'll see you soon.